Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Oh. So today I'm going to be talking about cryptoeconomics and the potential for a new digital gold standard. I hope I didn't rug too many of you because I know cryptonomics tends to have a different connotation in crypto spaces, but this is more of like a conventional economics approach to the origins of money. A lot of stuff going on in the Fed and sort of the role that crypto could play in mitigating a lot of the damage that the Federal Reserve is doing and a lot of central banks across the world are also doing. Just for a little background on myself, maybe you've seen me from Twitter. I'm a PhD student in economics at George Mason, and I hold a master's degree and a bachelor's degree in economics as well. I'm Blockworks economic strategist, and I work with the quantitative research team at Tantra Labs. Prior to Blockworks and Tantra, I was a consultant for a few large financial institutions that worked on unilateral and bilateral lending to developing countries. So a lot of my work was in productivity and growth, which is both areas that we've seen a lot of interest in this year due to the COVID pandemic. So I just wanted to start on sort of the origins of money, like the economic origins of money and the development of money from the barter system to the gold standard to now. So Carl Menger is an economist who's known for sort of founding what's known as like the rules of money. So obviously there's no formal rule set for what money is or what money can be. There's no government that has a rule book for how money should look. And so when Carl Menger wrote on the origins of money, he talked a lot about coordination and sort of the lack of coordination and how money is actually the result of a social phenomena. So he talks about money as an enigma because it's not, the government didn't come in and say, oh, here's, $1 and this is what you're all going to use. It was the result of a bunch of uncoordinated individuals coming together and trying to find a solution when barter systems no longer worked and when the Industrial Revolution sort of took over everything and people no longer had the means to, when portability no longer worked, for lack of better terms. So the general parameters for money are its transactional ability, its transportability, and its time constraints. In modern era, we don't worry too much about transportability because we have plastic money, we have dollars, we have cryptocurrency. We don't have to worry too much about carrying around gold coins or gold bars. Places where you do see a lot of worry about transportability are places where hyperinflation is rampant. Think Venezuela, where there is no strong institutional structure and you have, a piece of bread's 10,000 Venezuelan bolivars. In terms of its parameters, a little bit more in depth, you have the salableness and spatial limits. So in terms of salableness, you're talking about transactional ability. And what really matters is demand, purchasing power, supply, divisibility, the market for it, and regulatory constraints. Where government is supposed to intervene is just in terms of regulatory constraints. So they're not supposed to artificially change demand or purchasing power or supply or divisibility or even enter the market. All we should see government do is facilitate regulation so that we can trust that when you go to the grocery store, your dollar will work just as well as it would at the mall. So essentially by accepting coins or fiat money as legal tender. However, in the modern era, they tend to intervene in all of these categories. In terms of the spatial limits or transportability, you have division, cost, development, arbitrage, and restrictions or regulations affecting trade. Again, the only area in which government is supposed to intervene is on these restrictions or regulatory parameters affecting trade. So what we're seeing now a lot, especially in terms of the United States and in terms of the Fed, is this issue of time constraints, where people are starting to worry, oh, my dollar is not going to be worth the same tomorrow as it is today, because the government is inflating the money supply through the Federal Reserve. Need permanence just refers to the fact that we need it. We need something to transact with each other. Durability isn't too much of a worry anymore now that we have plastic money, and in terms of dollars and actual currency, the government does change and update coins and dollars as they wear out. Cost of storage isn't really a worry. What is a worry is the rate of interest or depreciation. So the depreciation of the dollar is a direct result of the government intervening in one of the other parameters I just talked about, which is the supply. And with our time preferences being constrained, meaning that we can't really say, okay, well, I want this dollar to have value tomorrow, we don't get to set those limits. The government intervenes there and sets those for us as well. So this is going into a bit of a sound money argument. The physical properties versus the economic properties. The key economic property here is scarcity. So you want your currency to be scarce in some respects because you want it to have value. Scarcity is what gives things value. And if you have an infinite supply of something, it's not going to have value. So this is a direct comparison between commodity monies and fiat, particularly gold and fiat, because the very common sound money argument is that gold is sound money, gold was sound money. And that what ended up happening wasn't the result of gold failing during the gold standard era, it was the result of governments not being able to constrain their spending, and gold just not working as a mechanism or a constraint. It was simply a tool for the governments to push off their spending into the next period. And I'll talk a bit more about that later.
Sorry, what was the last line? What does that mean?
Sorry?
Code news, what does that mean?
Our ability to know that it is money. Sorry. So the whole enigma of money is that it isn't a product of government or by government. It's a product of social interaction. So we don't trust in our governments necessarily. We trust in each other, right? So you can trust that you're going to go to the barber and he's going to cut your hair, and that you can give him your money for that, and the service he's giving you, you're exchanging for your money, and you can take that money and you can go to the grocery store and you trust that the farmer is going to produce your goods. And you trust that the government is going to continue to qualify your currency as a legal tender so that you know that you can use it. You don't necessarily trust that your government is giving it intrinsic value. You trust that the value comes from from individuals who make up the market and the economy. And so, again, their role should simply be to regulate and facilitate the dispersion of it, but that role has changed into the actual manipulation of money. So the gold standard is often used as like the closest sort of relative to what a crypto standard would be. And so I'm going to focus a bit on the United States. It is around the anniversary of like the Bretton Woods era, or the end of the Bretton Woods era. So in 1792, Congress first established the mint. And in the Constitution, Congress gives an entity the power to create currency, just to create and mint coins and to deem them legal or illegal. And then they established the first Bank of the United States, which is terminated, and then the second Bank of the United States, which is also terminated. And so around the beginning of the classical gold standard, we were actually on a bimetallic standard. And so what we saw up until World War I was actually a pretty solid gold standard. People were able to transact. There wasn't too much worry about whether or not, there was no central entity to interject. But what happened during World War I was that deficits ran high. So because deficits ran high, especially abroad, Germany had to pay back war debts. In order to pay off the deficits, they gave away all of their reserves. So again, this issue is that when an exogenous shock happens, something external happens, and governments are required to spend money, they don't look to raising revenues, they don't look to generating revenues elsewhere, they look to just spending whatever solid currency they have and then creating a new one to inflate the supply. There's no real constraint. It's a systematic issue, not like a matter of the tools that we have. So yeah, Germany left the gold standard after World War I, and the beginning of the end of the US gold standard began at the onset of the Great Depression. So at the onset of the Great Depression, FDR was worried about the run banks, so he essentially froze the spending of gold reserves because he didn't want what happened in Germany to happen in the United States. So for a few years, you could still redeem US dollars for gold, well, for more than a few years, from the Great Depression until 1970, you could still redeem US dollars for gold. And then President Nixon officially removed the United States off the gold standard in 1971 when he ended convertibility. What followed after is known as the Nixon shock, and that was a period of stagflation and high unemployment that lasted for several decades. So another idea that was reflected in the early days of the gold standard is Greshams Law. So like, as I mentioned, we were kind of on a bimetallic standard where we had some silver coinage and some gold coinage. I think it was at first it was a 15-to-1 ratio, and then it was a 16-to-1 ratio. But the general principle is that bad money drives out good money. And so if you have something that's worth less, you're going to transact with it, and you're going to spend with it, because you're going to want to hold or hoard what is worth more, right? So because gold was worth more than silver, people held gold, saved gold, didn't spend gold, and therefore it was driven out of circulation. So this is an argument that's brought up a lot today regarding like the relationship between whether it's cryptocurrencies being pitted against each other or cryptocurrencies versus the dollar. And the general sentiment is that we will continue to use bad money in transactions because we're going to want to hold what is worth more as a hedge. So now going into a bit about the Federal Reserve and finance today. Interesting fun fact, the Fed was never supposed to be an actual central bank. It wasn't supposed to be the central monetary authority. It wasn't supposed to have as much power as it has today. It was originally created in order to inject liquidity because of the run on banks and the crisis, the panic of 1907. Today, its dual mandate has changed a lot. So it operates on a dual mandate of price stability and maintaining maximum and full employment. What it can do is intervene in commercial and private credit markets, lend to private banks and private businesses, and directly control the supply of money and the rate of inflation. So there are pros and cons to having a natural rate of inflation. The issue with what we're seeing now is that there's no such thing as a natural rate of inflation because the Fed controls everything. I had somebody ask me an interesting question the other day regarding raising the interest rate, because the typical tool for combating inflation is for the Fed to just raise the interest rate. And the person asked me, well, if they raise the interest rate, then banks are incentivized to lend out more, right? Because they're making more money. So why wouldn't they want to lend out more? Even if, to some degree consumers can't afford it, there still could be a greater level of profit there, and there could be a greater level of inflation if more lenders chose to actually borrow from banks. The issue is that the Federal Reserve pays on reserves for banks. So when they raise the interest rate, they also raise the IOER and the IORR and the IORB, all of the interest rates on reserves for banks. The Federal Reserve directly pays banks to not lend when they raise the interest rate because it's more profitable to pay them on excess reserves. So they can also change the reserve ratio. There's a certain amount of reserves that banks are required to hold after the Great Depression and the run on banks. And the Fed can alter that a bit and then alter the rate at which they're actually paying interest on those reserves. What we're seeing now is, what we're seeing in March was more of sort of this, inflation was getting back to normal, right? We saw a deflationary period from March to May of 2020 because people weren't spending. And inflation only occurs when people are circulating the money in the economy. And so earlier this year, when we were just seeing a return to sort of the normal rate of inflation, it was correlated with economic growth, and it was just a sign that things were getting back to normal. However, now it's running a bit rampant, and we're seeing things go out of control because the Fed is focusing so much on maximum employment and obtaining employment as it was pre-pandemic. Deflation also has a lot of negatives. I see deflation talked about a lot as this very, very positive thing because it increases your purchasing power. It tends to increase purchasing power. But in terms of business cycles and the way that the financial system works today, it's typically associated with recessions and depressions and correlated with low growth and productivity. And it causes the real cost of borrowing to increase as interest rates rise. Both real and nominal interest rates usually rise. And declines in prices can also result in lower productivity as producers are no longer incentivized to produce at their maximum. So the application to US monetary policy today is interesting because something that a lot of people neglect is that the velocity of money is rapidly falling. And so the velocity of money is the rate at which people are actually using it to spend transactionally domestically in the United States. So what I have up here is Fisher's equation of exchange, which is MV equals PY, whereas mainstream economics defines inflation with pi. M is the money supply, V is the velocity of money, P is the price level, and Y is output, growth, the amount of revenues. It's also denoted as T and Q quite often. But what we're seeing is that since 2010, there's been a stark drop in the actual transactionality of the US dollar in the United States. This could be going into assets, this could be going into foreign investments, but regardless, people are not spending as much money, right? So when we look at the level of the money supply and how it's increased drastically this year, but inflation hasn't matched up with it, it's because people aren't actually circulating it through the economy. So a bit more about like velocity. So as I said, MV equals PY, PQ, PT. Money supply, velocity of money, price level, and real GDP. Both sides of the equation are supposed to equal nominal GDP. The left side is supposed to be what's bought by buyers, and the right side is supposed to be what is sold by producers. So economics is a little, they like to hold things constant to simplify, but that's not what happens in the real world, right? So a lot of times velocity is held constant, and real GDP or output is also held constant or stagnant because it only changes by 2 to 3% per year. So going into that a little bit more, here where 1 over V equals M over PT is the actual, I'm trying to explain this in non-math terms. It's the rate of transactionality and the actual amount of money needed for one transaction. Whereas if you look at where M equals KPY and K equals 1 over V, we're assuming that K and Y stay constant, which allows us to assume that any increase in the money supply is directly proportional to an increase in the price level, which is clearly not what we're seeing today. Because if we were truly seeing, low real capital in the economy and low productivity, we would expect to see this high level of inflation that we're just not really getting. And again, this is because the money demand curve is not moving. So we're shifting over the actual supply of money, we're increasing the supply of money, but the demand for money isn't changing, it's actually falling. And so tying this into inflation, there's 2 types of inflation. There's cost push inflation and there's demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation is the result of aggregate supply shocks. So if there was like a fire at a lumber mill that directly reduced the supply of lumber and the price of lumber went up because of that, that would be cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation is what we're seeing now in economies where people are resuming spending and suppliers just don't have enough supply to keep up with it. During COVID, the beginning days of COVID, that was like masks and hand sanitizer, right? It wasn't an actual issue with the supply of masks or hand sanitizer. The optimal level of those things existed. It was that individuals wanted to purchase more and the prices were driven up because of shortages. And this is everybody's favorite chart, it seems. the M2 money stock with a recession shaded, and we can see this drastic increase. So in 2008, during the Great Recession, the first financial crisis of the 2000s, the Fed began the purchasing of real assets, and it began holding them on its balance sheet. It's pretty new. But since the time the Fed was created, they had open market operations. So they could still inject liquidity into the economy. but they began real asset purchasing, essentially in order to suppress the level of inflation by holding these assets and paying out interest. So, as you can see, the biggest jump occurred in 2020 in the summer, but we saw deflation then, and that's because people weren't spending. People had nowhere to go. This is also relatively overlooked, I think. The federal deficit has been growing a lot, and has essentially the spending, like government spending as a proportion of GDP, is at its highest rate since the 40s. So the government is injecting a lot of fiscal stimulus into the economy because it's focusing so much not on price stability, but on maximum employment, or what it thinks should be maximum employment, right? But the Fed, the government, nobody has perfect foresight. So we don't actually know, we can't actually measure in real time whether or not people are wanting to go back to work. You can survey people, but you don't know for sure whether or not people are actually wanting to go back to work, or whether people have found other occupations that maybe don't count as typical employment, right? So by spending so much and focusing so much on employment, we're driving up the deficit in a way that is potentially detrimental and could result in economic overheating. And in the meantime, the Fed is trying to inflate away this debt. So here's what I was talking about a bit. This is CPI and M2. If you look at April of 2020, you can see that they are at opposite ends of each other. That's because that's that money holding by individuals, just not having anywhere to go. Typically, we see sort of these periods and then a spike in CPI, because the Fed isn't increasing the money supply on a regular basis, right? So it expects around 3% money growth, but we're seeing a lot higher than that. So what really... Sorry? Oh, the Consumer Price Index. So this is for all urban consumers and all items in U.S. city average, is a measure of prices. Non-agricultural prices, because it's typically, the reason why it's just for urban consumers is because prices tend to be lower in general in less dense areas, and that's a skew. So, but in general, it's just an index of things, not utilities. Some foods are excluded, no electricity, but just a general bundle of prices of goods. So it shows the changing fluctuation in the price of goods. But there is a lot excluded from it. Rent is excluded from it. Like I said, utilities are excluded from it. Some really random foods are excluded from it because traditionally they were seasonal. So they didn't want any of these like seasonal aspects to affect the CPI, but the Fed doesn't really update indicators very often. So there's definitely a lot missing from it, but it's probably one of the closest measures in addition to PCE. Does that?
This is quarterly change, right? This is quarterly change.
This is percent change per year.
No, but the solution was 15% inflation.
Yeah, it was 15% inflation, but this is just the percent change per year.
If you guys want to talk, you need to talk. Okay.
So yes, inflation, it was actually around 20%, but this is just its year-to-year change. So because it was already high, the year-to-year change wasn't as drastic, if that makes sense. And so this is what a lot of economists, the Federal Reserve, the United States President Joe Biden, are using as a measure of the health of the economy. So employment and unemployment, they are indicators of growth, but you can't use one statistic to forecast the actual health and success of the economy and the actual trajectory. What they're saying is that we've started to exhibit a V-shaped recovery, and thus we need to bounce back to where we were. But this isn't really a V-shaped recovery. The line is flattening, which is indicative of a real change. So the big debate was whether or not we were going to see a nominal change or a real change, whether or not nominal income, nominal productivity was going to be affected, or real income and productivity were going to be affected. And now, as time goes on, it's starting to look increasingly like we are seeing a real change, which would mean that the level of employment will actually stay a bit lower until the economy catches back up to its real growth path, right? So we can't expect for it to jump back up, and injecting a lot of money into the economy, planning a lot of fiscal stimulus, it's all just going to result in overheating and increased inflation if we're actually miscalculating where employment should be, and we're continuing to inject money fiscally. So as I mentioned, here's a little inflation calculation for you. It's actually super simple to calculate inflation, which is funny because the Fed acts like it's very difficult and that they never know. But if you know what the money supply is going to be growing at, you can use this equation of exchange, MV equals PY, in order to actually get what you can expect inflation to be in the long run, right? So the main issue is that the Fed isn't going to be open about what it thinks the money supply is going to grow at because it expects panic. Earlier this year, they took away the graph and the indicators for M2, the M2 money supply. But they kept M2 SL, right? So there was a lot of panic because everybody was like, oh, why'd you take away M2? What'd you do? What they did was change the frequency because they didn't want it to be as volatile, which is interesting. So Powell, the Fed, they're very aware that people are looking very closely at inflation, at overheating concerns, and they don't want to show as many changes in the actual volatility of the money supply, so they change from weekly to monthly. And they're not going to come out and tell us what they think that the growth of M is going to be. So you can use this calculation based on what you think the growth in the money supply is going to be. And I think by a lot of estimates, this summer was between 3 to 8% is what a lot of economists were forecasting, inflation-wise, depending on how quickly people were going to go out, depending on how quickly the vaccine was distributed. And now I think we're starting to see, we're inching towards 6%. So just a quick summary of the global economy, because I've talked a lot about the US. In the past, we were in a deflationary period, right? We had a lot of recessions, especially in Latin America. Venezuela aside, Venezuela and its sky-high inflation aside, we're seeing inflation now because many countries are participating in fiscal programs. And the effect of halting travel in Latin America really stagnated their economy. So this all resulted in huge changes in the debt to GDP ratio across the board. So a lot of countries are having this debt to GDP ratio crisis where their level of debt is very, very quickly consuming most of GDP, if not more than GDP. China is actually leading the front on that, but this is, I think, just China's data was updated after this graph was created. But the growing problem is that it's a pattern, right? So history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. But given the face of external shocks, governments will just spend, right? And some of the spending is necessary in order to get the economy back on its path. There was a huge level of unemployment, and some people genuinely needed the rent assistance. But it becomes a matter of at what point is it too much? And at what point are we not going to look at the economy and what we actually need to spend on? And when is the government actually going to be constrained? So for the potential role of cryptocurrency, is Bitcoin digital gold? No. I don't think any cryptocurrency is digital gold. I think they're better than that. And a lot of this comes from the fact that there's a lot of, with gold, you have a lot of supply shock issues, right? So gold isn't fixed. And in order for a currency to be truly sound, you need to have some sort of fixed element, right? So in terms of like the volatility in the price of gold, like right, because gold had already reached the point where it was transactional, so it was already more stable. You had issues with supply shocks, you had issues with international trade, you had a lot of government regulation and constraints on it, also because it had a dual use. It's used in jewelry, decor, etc. So it wasn't truly sound money, which brings me to this point. Herbert Hoover, 1933, was very opposed to FDR's removal of the gold standard and said, we have gold because we cannot trust governments, which is proven to be very true. But even with gold, like I said, Germany, paid off all of their debt in their reserves and created their own currency and inflated that, and then we did the same thing, paying other debts. So the issue comes down to a very fundamental issue of institutions. The problem isn't a new tool. It's not that we need a new tool, it's that we need a new system. No tool is going to constrain government. It's just going to become a vehicle of government procrastination, of government monopoly, right? So any sort of mechanism that we try to adopt, regardless of how sound we think it can be sound, but it can fail, right? Because that's not a failure of gold, or it's not a market failure, it's a government failure, right? Because government can change things in the long run. So that's where sort of the myth, I think, that economists talk about in terms of ultrasound money is that there is nothing more than sound money. The money's either sound or it's not. And having a deflationary mechanism is artificial. So the goal of sound money is for all other intervention to be removed, right? So you want a currency that operates completely soundly on its own and has no other mechanism by which anything artificial can be introduced. I was talking to Dan Held of Kraken the other day, and he was describing the economy and the Federal Reserve as a car, right? And the car is driving, the Fed's in the front seat, and the Fed can't see out the window because it can't predict into the future, neither can the government, right? But the Fed can use its imagination to think about what it's seeing in the future because it can look in its rearview mirror, right? So by doing that, by using hindsight, the Fed can sort of predict what it thinks is going to happen and act ahead of time. But what we want in a currency is for it to just react to what's going on in the environment, right? He used the example of think about like an autonomous car. It just reacts to the things around it. It doesn't actually alter the path of the economy. It lets the market freely regulate itself, and it is allowed to accurately respond. So in terms of like inflation, interest rates and stuff like that, they would be able to adjust on their own. So when I first started putting together this presentation, my time horizons for adoption or even countries accepting it as legal tender was like way out in the future. So it was interesting because in the midst of all of this, El Salvador came out and started accepting Bitcoin as a legal tender. And so I was a little hesitant to celebrate at first just because it seems very early. And my issue, again, comes down to the fundamental problem with institutions and distrust in institutions. So if we have already crumbling institutions and there's no real incentive for them to change, sure, they can adopt things that perhaps make things more efficient on the margin and that perhaps help their citizens keep value in currency in other ways. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be efficient or effective or work so well, because they still have the ability to inflate away their own currency, and they still have, well, they're dollarized, but they still have the ability to alter their own money supply and to create fiscal policies and to spend. There's no real incentive to not spend. So I wanted to end with another Karl Menger quote, which is one of my favorites. Still we are confronted by this phenomenon. Still we have to explain why it is that the economic man is ready to accept a certain kind of commodity even if he does not need it or if his need of it is already supplied. I think it's a great quote because it really talks about human nature, which is a beautiful thing, right? Why would we just accept something? It's not because our government tells us, it's because we know that there's a need for it. And it's because we trust each other and we want to exchange with each other. It's because it makes our lives more efficient. But when it no longer works, it's very natural for humans to look for other systems. And now the issue is convincing the greater public that this is no longer working. Especially after the COVID period, I think, was a time in which a lot of people trusted more in government for some reason, and a lot of people trusted less in government for good reason. and the fact that this growing fiscal debt, this growing fiscal deficit, and this growing role of the Federal Reserve is not going to change anytime soon. And it's only going to get worse. And there's going to become a point where it's inevitable that something happens with the deficit, whether it's a debt default or whether we have to adopt a different sort of control mechanism. Here's a meme for you all. But yeah, so thanks so much for coming. Blockworks is hosting a Bretton Woods event. You cannot meet me there because I won't be there actually, but you should definitely check it out. Definitely go. We also announced our another DeFi event actually with more details to come for early 2022. So yeah, if there's any questions, happy to.
So what about Ethereum instead of Bitcoin as alternative for the future of money?
So I think the issue that I've heard a lot and that I sort of buy into, I know I like how I'm saying this at an Ethereum conference. I'm about to get like burned at the stake after this, but is that there are changes to the monetary policy, right? And so the beauty of having something that's completely fixed or untouched is that there's no way for anything to be artificial. So what I've heard, like the common fear against it, is that because some things are still up for debate, it still allows room for artificial changes. And that is what we're trying to avoid in finding real sound money.
Is inflation more cause of the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply or by the increase of loans given out by commercial banks?
So it's a bit of both. It's definitely a result of this drastic increase in the money supply. But in addition, it's coming from the fact that people are now spending in the economy again. Banks are loaning out a lot of money because the interest rate's super low, and people are able to exchange really easily. The velocity of money is still falling, but relative to what's going on now, the reason why we're seeing inflation is because spending is a lot higher than it was at this time last year. And what matters with that is whether or not we'll see a change past this fall. So for a lot of economists, the indicator is going to be once seasonality of like travel slows down in the fall, which is also, employment will also sort of buffer down a little bit, which is why its slow growth is so concerning right now. A lot of it depends on what happens in the fall. And so if things continue on an upward trend in terms of inflation in the fall, we'll definitely see Fed action. And in their minutes, they came out and said that they're thinking about tapering asset purchasing as early as Q4 of this year.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank
It was
you.
great. And my question would be, or I would start with a question, whether you even consider Bitcoin a money. Would you call it money?
As it is now, like as it is right now, no. I would say that it's on its way to being money. It could be on its way to being money, but right now it's being used as primarily a store of value. So, like, yes, it is. It can embody all the characteristics of money. It is money, but is it money that's being used transactionally? I don't know. I wouldn't want to use my Bitcoin to buy a cup of coffee.
You wouldn't?
Not right now, not as it is. And
Okay.
I think a lot of people in the Bitcoin community still see it as this sort of, well, I mean, it's been rough times lately, but we're still holding on, so.
So is it because of the Greshams Law, or like you don't want to?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the reasoning. So when people who aren't maybe into crypto but are into economics ask me, oh, like why don't you want to spend it on things then? Like why don't you want to give it to me to split our Uber ride or whatnot? I say, well, Greshams Law. I want to hold on to the currency that I think is more valuable, and I'll give you my worthless fiat.
Okay. So, but if you want to hold on better money, you get your salary in crypto or Bitcoin then.
I've been trying.
Okay, because like,
I've been trying.
if all my money is in Bitcoin, which for me it is, I have to spend it. I have to eat something. So
Yeah, no, so that's the difference,
then
right?
You're
Yeah.
creating the economy, and the circular Bitcoin economy. I call it the parallel economy. But do I have to give you the microphone? Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've been trying, but at Blockworks.
Based on like what he said, it seems more like the Bitcoin would be the commodity, at least now. My question is like, it seems that you are very against like, monetary policies in general, but then like we have different economies. So I mean, how it will work that, I mean, the economies will lose any power to adjust to like different growth, different situations, and basically there will be a collapse. I mean, the economies can't function if they can't adjust to these differences.
Yeah, so I'm a proponent of like the free banking system. I don't know if you're familiar. So it's actually a system in which there's no central bank. It's like a, how do I explain this? It's like a collection of banks who have a free-floating interest rate and can actually have their own currencies. That's something that was pretty successful in Scotland. So it's not like the complete lack of any sort of system. It's the lack of a central system.
Yeah, but then still, how do you adjust it?
Like adjust.
Well, the money supply,
Well, you
the money supply, the trade, all of these things,
you
right?
don't adjust the money supply.
Then the economies can't grow.
Well, the idea is that like growth shouldn't come from liquidity. Growth shouldn't come from increasing the monetary supply.
Right, but the economies, they have like a different piece, they have pace, they have different situations.
Right, and it would require the revolutionization of like all of these pieces together and all of these economies together. It wouldn't work, obviously, on like a small scale. Like this requires like great institutional change from the ground up.
Yeah, it seems that there will be only one single big economy.
Well, yeah, I mean, we are the globalization, I guess. You could say it's a globalized argument.
So, recording the change of money supply from the gold standard and we know they can buy it from one. So I see. But okay, deflationary. That make it.
Right now, I'm so sorry, but would you mind taking this conversation